Good day. It was just a few weeks ago that I was covering on this channel and with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the Duran, the G7 meeting which took place in Cornwall in England. Now, the G7, or Group of Seven, is this grouping of the core members of the Western Alliance led by the United States. Apart from the United States, Canada and Japan, the other four countries that make up the G7, Britain, France, Germany and Italy, are of course European NATO member states. This has been frustrating to many people because other countries, which are perhaps equally important around the world, are not participants at these meetings, though the European Union, paradoxically, though it is not formally a country, is. In addition, there has been great anguish expressed in recent years that the G7 is starting to lose relevance, given the fact that, in contrast to when it was formed at the end of the 1970s, it no longer dominates collectively the world economy as it once did. Russia, by the way, was never a member of the G7, contrary to what many people think. It was a member of an entirely different entity called the G8. There would be G7 summit meetings and Russia would be present, but it would not participate. And then after those important G7 meetings took place, there would be a G8 meeting in which the Russians were also involved. The Russians were deeply humiliated and frustrated by that process, and when they were expelled in 2014, following the events in Ukraine, they were actually relieved and delighted to have done away with an experience they found humiliating. Perhaps nothing illustrates better the total unreality with which the G7 operates, that it continues to say at each meeting that Russia has not been invited to attend and that the G8 remains suspended, even though the Russians have made repeatedly clear that they have no intention of ever reviving the G8 again and are thankful that it is gone as far as they are concerned once and for all. Anyway, returning to that G7 meeting in Cornwall, I remember reading an absolutely impossibly long communiqué that was published there shortly after Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, and Joe Biden, the US President, had signed off on a new Atlantic Charter, another impossibly long document, wading through page after page of obtuse and weighty and dense prose, none of which seemed to mean or say actually very much that was meaningful at all. And I also remember the extent to which the G7 communique, immensely long as it was, seemed morbidly focused on Russia, dealing with Russia at extraordinary and extravagant length, making it clear that Russia today was seen by the G7 as an adversary, and how it also came round to saying critical things about China, also identified as an adversary at that summit meeting, though with some of the European G7 states expressing some skepticism and some doubt. Anyway, that was then, and today is now. Now we have a G7 meeting, a virtual meeting this time, again chaired by Boris Johnson, and it is very different, and the agenda is very different. Instead of the pompous words, the extravagant language, the vast overarching ambitions, the talk about the West standing up to the wicked Russians and the naughty Chinese, this time the focus entirely and exclusively is going to be Afghanistan and the unfolding debacle which is taking place there. And the particular emphasis this time, supposedly, is going to be the evacuation from Kabul. And we understand, and our media, at least in Britain, are full of reports that Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron are going to try to press Joe Biden, the President of the United States, to get the deadline of 31st August 2021, by which time this evacuation is supposed to end, that they want to get it extended, though there is no debate or explanation of how long that extension will be. And supposedly there's going to be some kind of high noon event at this G7 summit with Johnson and Macron lining up against Biden, this time perhaps with the Germans, Merkel quietly supporting the European countries, Britain and France, against the United States. And consider already how completely that rearranges all the pieces from the events in Cornwall, because of course in Cornwall it was the United States, it was Biden who was coming. He was talking about how America was back, how the United States was going to re-engage with all its allies, how it was going to prioritize making or rebuilding the Western alliance and reforging it again and repairing all the damage supposedly done by his predecessor, Donald Trump. And instead what we see, if you are to believe the reports, what we're going to see instead is a quarrel, an argument driven by an issue, a real issue, and anger of the kind that we never saw when Donald Trump was actually at a G7 summit meeting. Now, I say according to the reports, because I'm going to be saying straightforwardly that I am deeply skeptical about these reports. I'm not sure that in reality, much of anything, of any substance, is actually going to happen at this G7 summit meeting. And the reason I say that is because it's become absolutely clear over the last few days that it is the Taliban who are actually in control of the evacuation flights from Kabul. Not only do they control the access to the airport, but they control Kabul and all the surrounding hills and mountains. And as the US former Marine and intelligence officer Scott Ritter has pointed out, Kabul airport is a natural trap. It is surrounded by all sides, on either by high ground or by residential buildings, and aircraft and personnel located there can easily be targeted by mortar shells and rocket launchers, causing devastating casualties to any troops or civilians trapped there. And moreover, because the Taliban control the high ground, they would be able to fire on any aircraft trying to land on Kabul airport from those hills and mountains which surround it, with heavy caliber machine guns and anti-aircraft guns, and conceivably even surface-to-air missiles if they have any. And that would make the whole operation of evacuating anybody from Kabul all but impossible. And in fact, the troops in Kabul airport could very easily be trapped. And in fact, Scott Ritter made comparisons between the debacle of the French in Dien Bien Phu during the Indochina War of the early 1950s, when a French military force was also trapped by the Vietnamese Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, back in the 1950s in a similar way. And it's quite clear that the Americans are fully aware of the parallels and of the risks, and they are not prepared to engage the Taliban in the kind of conflict which could pile on a military debacle by the US military on top of a political one, a debacle of such severity that it's doubtful that this administration would survive So it is likely, and in fact, Biden himself has said that the United States will resist pressure from its allies to extend that 31st August deadline. And of course, the Taliban, for their part, have emphatically ruled it out and have spoken about it as being a red line. I would add that the only circumstance in which I can see that 31st August deadline being extended is with the Taliban's agreement. And I suspect that in return for such an extension, the Taliban would make demands of the United States that the United States might have great difficulty agreeing to. For example, the Taliban might insist that those $7 billion of reserves held in Afghanistan's central bank, which the United States has now seized, are unblocked and returned to them. Or it could be that the Taliban will be making more demands and demanding more concessions from the United States than the United States is willing to agree to. It seems that the US military in Kabul airport now has some kind of communications line with the Taliban, and I think, frankly, that the United States would be unwilling to rock the boat by entering into negotiations which might disrupt the present evacuation and which might end up dragging the United States into a bidding game with the Taliban, in which the Taliban held all the cards and would be, in effect, in a position to blackmail the United States. Moreover, as I understand it, the situation in Kabul airport is actually starting, finally, after so many days, to stabilize. And for the first time, more people were evacuated from the airport in a stable and organized way than has been the case up to now. Supposedly around 10,000 people were airlifted out, and hopefully that evacuation, after so many days of chaos and shambles, will continue from now on in the same much more organized way. So I think that the United States is going to resist demands from the G7, from its G7 allies, Britain and France, and probably Germany, for an extension of the 31st August deadline. And I think the British and the French and the Germans know that. And I think that all of this so-called quarrel that's going to happen at the G7 is really so much theatre and melodrama, with the British and the French, especially the British, acting out this drama in order to appease domestic political forces. In Britain, specifically, these come from the right. I would use that word in inverted commas, the militaristic neocon wing, if you prefer, of the Conservative Party, led by a whole group, by the way, of ex-army officers of, I notice, middling rank, people like Ian Duncan Smith, Tobias Ellwood, Johnny Mercier, and of course Tom Tugendhat, who seem to be aching for some way to fight back at the Taliban, to hit back at the Taliban in order to supposedly restore British prestige and Western prestige in Afghanistan. And I suspect in the case of Macron, it is intended straightforwardly to embarrass the United States, as Macron whispers in everybody's ears that the United States is no longer fully reliable and that Europe should instead follow his lead and set up a common European army. So I think this is all theatre and melodrama. I don't think there is any reality to it. Having said that, it is a piece of theatre which, though it has no reality, will nonetheless have certain consequences. Biden himself, or at least the administration, cannot be happy with the way in which their allies, or supposed allies, have turned on them as a result of this debacle. And I would have thought, especially the British, are now treading on very thin ground and may find that unless they play their cards much more carefully than they have been doing up to now, they could make some serious enemies at the top of the Democratic Party. And I think also that the United States in general will not appreciate this appearance of division at a G7 summit, humiliating to the United States as it is at the very same time that the United States is trying to rally its allies in this great epic confrontation with the Chinese that it is now working towards in the Far East, in the Pacific. I would add that Kamala Harris, who is currently on an Asian tour, going to Singapore and Vietnam under the disastrous slogan of America is back, must also feel, if she has the intelligence to see it, though perhaps she doesn't, that the rug has also been pulled under her feet. She's probably coming to Vietnam, hoping to persuade the Vietnamese, who possess far and away the strongest military in this part of the world, to join up with the United States in confronting China, except, of course, that the Vietnamese, who have already a past history of fighting the Americans and seeing what they really amount to, cannot be impressed by the events in Kabul and must be saying to themselves that aligning with this country could quite probably be a mistake. I would add that the Vietnamese have up to now resisted all attempts by the United States to win them over in this crusade against China. And what has happened in Afghanistan, I suspect, is going to confirm them in that view. So I think that the United States must be feeling very uncomfortable and very unhappy with the way things are playing out in diplomatic terms, and they will certainly not be happy to be criticized openly by their allies from Europe at this time when they're trying to win over and failing to win over allies in Asia. Anyway, there we are. How the mighty have fallen. Well, of course, arguably, they were not so mighty in the first place. The G7 summit meeting, held with so much pomp and circumstance, with so many brave words, so many oceans of brave words, has been exposed yet again for the irrelevant institution it actually is. Now, I'm going to finish with a little comment which, to my mind, again illustrates and demonstrates the utter absurdity and delusional nature with which the British in particular, but also some of the Western powers, are approaching this matter. There's a long article in the Daily Telegraph by Tom Tugendhat, the chairman of the House of Commons, a select committee on foreign affairs, an extreme hardliner, a person who takes a belligerent and confrontational attitude against China and Russia, and an extreme hardliner and critic of the US decision to pull out of Afghanistan and of the evacuation from there. Anyway, Tugendhat talks about how this G7 meeting is going to be a pivotal moment in his dreams. And he also talks about the importance of getting other powers on board. And he talks about India, and he speaks about India as a country which might want to attend this G7 meeting. Well, he is right about one thing. India is a pivotal country. It is a country with many problems. Its economy has not been in particularly good shape recently. And the Prime Minister Modi's ratings have been falling and falling fast. And so politically and economically, perhaps India at the moment is not in the best of shape. And of course, it suffered a major diplomatic reverse in Afghanistan. Nonetheless, it is undoubtedly true, or at least it is true in my opinion, that India is indeed a rising power. I'm confident that it will get through whatever problems it is experiencing now, and it will indeed increasingly play a more active role in world affairs. However, the Indians do not seem to be in any great hurry to attend this G7 meeting, and though perhaps and eventually they might be persuaded to join, it is a virtual summit meeting after all, and perhaps the Indian Prime Minister Modi himself, might actually participate. It's actually very interesting to see who is the first person he turned to and spoke to. And that person is not President Biden of the United States, and it's certainly not Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Britain. It is President Putin of Russia. And in fact, we've just received information from the Kremlin that Modi and Putin have just had a very long telephone conversation, that they've discussed with each other the situation in Afghanistan in detail, and that they have agreed to remain in regular contact about the issue. So quite clearly and obviously, in sorting out the mess in Afghanistan and in trying to rebuild Indian influence there, the Indians have made what I've consistently said was the logical conclusion that wasting time with the United States, with the G7, which in practical terms is now exiting both Afghanistan and Central Asia, is a total waste of time, given their difficulties with China and Pakistan. Their obvious and proper course is to speak with that other friendly country which actually does retain some leverage over the process, which is Russia, and that is indeed precisely what Prime Minister Modi and the Indians have done. So an ineffective, theatrical, melodramatic, pointless even, G7 summit, one staged in order to impress a few people on the conservative backbenches and in order to give President Macron of France an opportunity to grandstand and whisper against NATO and the United States. The reality is that the diplomacy is happening elsewhere, off stage, certainly not at the G7 meeting. China and Russia are driving it, especially Russia, and it is to Russia that India turns, not to the G7. If they do attend that G7 meeting today, it will be a purely token presence, whereas the meeting, the conversation between Putin and Modi, as the Russian readout shows, was real and substantive. And there we are. A collective West, an attempt to reforge this alliance system, and it has cracked and stumbled at the first obstacle. America may indeed be back, but its allies are not working with it in harness. And heavens knows, if there really was going to be a plan, an idea, a structure for evacuating people from Afghanistan, the time to do it is not now, when we're just a few days away from the 31st August deadline, but way back in June at that G7 summit meeting in Cornwall, when it was already known that the United States was intending to pull out of Afghanistan, and when steps and measures should have been done at that time, at that meeting, to organize the evacuation both of the US and NATO troops and of the civilians who were there in a safe and structured and orderly way. Of course, that was not done because the G7 leaders preferred instead to talk their grand strategic plans, they make their criticisms of Russia, make their snide comments about China, all those things which, as I said, have been shown today to be exercises in illusion and futility. If you want to see an example, a case study of how a realistic foreign policy, one which deals with actual practical issues, how important that is, just go back, read all those communiques, all those statements that were being churned out in Cornwall back in June, and compare it with the practical issues which the G7 is trying and failing to address today. Thank you very much for joining me in this program. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel, and please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, the new free speech platform, SuperU, Rumble, and of course Locals, where we have a thriving community and where I'm now testing out my equipment as I prepare to take the plunge and face you all in live streams and in other interactions. And please also, if you want to support us, come to our do so. You can do so through PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar, and by coming to our shop and buying the wonderful things that you will find there, our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, please press the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and please also check your subscription to this channel. And thank you again for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.